Hello everyone, and welcome to our Week 2 lecture on Immanuel Kant's What is Enlightenment? Kant is a towering figure of modern philosophy, and he's an important figure for both social and political theory. He's also notoriously difficult to read. So what I thought we would do is take a look at this very, very short piece, very atypical piece for Kant. It is a response to a newspaper asking him to write on the question of what is enlightenment. And it happens to be a piece that a couple of our reading selections for this week are also directly addressing, particularly the Foucault and the Habermas. So Kant wants to know what is enlightenment, or he wants to say what is enlightenment, and he's writing this in a very tricky political situation. The Enlightenment is a social and intellectual movement that on its face seems extremely critical of contemporary social and political institutions. At the point that Kant is writing, it seems extremely critical of traditional authorities. And so he has to worry about those authorities cracking down on the movement and making it impossible to function. And what he does with this piece is he doesn't only defend the Enlightenment and define it, but he tries to reassure those authorities that the movement is not going to be threatening, that they can allow it to continue, that it's not something that needs to be suppressed. So what is the Enlightenment? It is the human being's emergence from his self-incurred minority, Kant says. Okay, minority is the inability to make use of one's own understanding without direction from another, and currently we're used to thinking of minority as something that applies to children. So you have to get to a certain age before you're regarded as ability to use your own understanding without someone else's direction. But at the point that Kant is writing, the overwhelming majority of people are not able to make use of their own understanding in any very free way without someone else's direction, whether it's the direction from the clergy or from the aristocracy or a monarch. So at the point that he's writing, there are actually very, very few people who are officially, formally allowed to make use of their own understanding in this way. And there's social institutions that prohibit them from doing so. But Kant doesn't want the Enlightenment to look like a movement that is threatening current social arrangements. He's worried that it will be cracked down on if it seems to threaten them. So he's not saying our problem is that other people, our laws, our government, our king, are not letting us emerge from our minority. Our criticism is not directed outward in that way. Our criticism is directed inward. We have a self-incurred minority. We understand how to direct our own affairs, but we lack courage. So again, it's a reassuring statement in terms of the traditional authorities at the time. This is not a critical movement aimed at you. It is aimed internally to achieve a transformation of thought and of selfhood inside. So who lacks the courage? He starts off with the very, very wealthy, people wealthy enough they can pay someone else to manage their affairs. He quickly moves on to the entire fair sex. Women lack the courage to manage their own affairs. There's some feminists who will have a word with him or two about this as we go forward in the course. But Kant does not want to say that there are existing institutions that are keeping people from managing their own affairs, although that may be the case. He's going to say we're not brave enough. And while we're at it, the great mass of all people everywhere aren't brave enough. And he makes the analogy between the sort of everyday mass of people and domesticated animals. People have been so trained to take direction from others that they're actually fond of it and they find comfort in it. And again, this is meant to be reassuring to the authorities at the time. Don't worry. Even if you took all the restrictions away, people wouldn't want to manage their own affairs. They're happy letting you do it. But there's a small exception. Hence, there are only a few who have succeeded by their own cultivation of their spirit in extricating themselves from minority and yet walking confidently. You can guess where Kant places himself, although to be fair, he is a towering philosophical figure, so he probably deserves a little bit of arrogance here. But he's saying there's only a small number of us. It's safe enough to let us go. It's okay. We'll talk and we'll debate and we'll criticize with each other, but most people are not going to participate in this. You just don't have to worry about it. But the Enlightenment wants to effect change. He is talking about eventually the great mass of people participating in it. So it's not only going to be that small number for all time. So why is it different from revolutionary movements? If I were a traditional authority at the time Kant is writing, I would be repressing revolutionary movements. Why shouldn't I be repressing the Enlightenment? And he says, look, revolution is a way that people overcome despots, and they do it really quickly. And it's good for that. The Enlightenment is a slow, gradual process. It is a transformation of self and of thought. And not only is it not revolutionary, but even if we wanted to do a revolutionary movement, revolution couldn't achieve it. So again, to the political authorities, don't worry, we're not that threatening. We do need freedom, he admits, but it's not a harmful kind of freedom. It's not dangerous. It's not risky to traditional authorities to allow it. It is the least harmful of anything that could be called freedom. It's just a tiny freedom. So what is this least harmful freedom? It is the freedom to make public use of one's reason in all matters. It's a freedom for public argument and criticism, and he says it is a freedom used by scholars writing for a reading public. Now, at the point that Kant is writing this, the reading public is a far smaller percentage of society than it would be today, but it's still regarded as quite threatening. You have a big expansion in literacy in this period. You've got an expansion of newspapers. Things are being written that haven't been properly controlled by the clergy or by the aristocracy. Criticisms are being made. Debates are breaking out. They seem a bit like people talk about the internet today, very decentralized and hard to control. But Kant is saying you need to allow this to happen. This freedom is okay because there's a special kind of people who participate in it. They're scholars writing for an educated public. Now, this is an argument, weirdly, that persists all the way up to today. Every once in a while you will see an academic write something and it's published in an academic journal, but it gets picked up in the mainstream press and politicians will intervene and criticize it, and the academic will often fire back with something like, I have academic freedom to write this. And it sort of sounds weird. What do you mean academic freedom to write it? Don't you have the same freedom of speech, or lack of freedom of speech, that all the rest of us have? Why should you as an academic be able to say anything or defend yourself with any special privilege that the rest of us couldn't use? But this notion dates back to this Enlightenment period, to these scholars trying to convince authorities that there's something special about them, that they can be allowed to entertain controversial or even dangerous topics because it is safe. It's only aimed at a discussing public. It's not aimed at practical transformation. Okay? And there are debates today over whether the concept of academic freedom in this sense has any validity or not. But Kant says this freedom's only going to be used for public debate and criticism. Privately, we must obey. Even if we're critical in the public discussion of what we're obeying, we still have to obey it. There's a difference between what happens when we debate it and what we actually do. And he moves into some examples. So if I'm an officer in the army and you give me an order, I have to obey it. But then when I'm no longer being an officer, when I step out of that role and I step into the role of a scholar, I can criticize your order publicly. We can debate whether it was a good idea. As a citizen, I have to pay my taxes. But I can also, as part of the public debate, criticize the specific tax or the very idea of taxation. But the thing he spends the longest on is the status of the clergy, and he thinks this is going to be a more controversial issue. It's why he spends the time on it that he does. But the clergy are a high percentage of the people who are literate enough and educated enough to engage in these Enlightenment era public debates. And so if the clergy are not allowed to participate, to use their reason in this public criticism, it's going to shut down a lot of the discussion. And Kant is trying to carve out a space for this clerical participation. And he says, look, when I talk about the public, I don't mean the congregation. That may be a really big space, but it's a really big private space. Clergy in that space have to obey the church. They need to do what the church tells them. But what's this going to look like if a member of the clergy is critical in the public debate of church doctrine? How are they going to teach that doctrine to their congregation? And Kant runs through a little exercise to visualize what it would look like. The clergy will say, our church leaders teach us this or that. Here are the arguments it uses. clergy is sort of distancing themselves from those arguments, but nevertheless, they will obey if they're told to teach these things. He then extracts all practical uses for his congregation from precepts to which he would not himself subscribe with full conviction, but which he can nevertheless undertake to deliver, because it's still not altogether impossible that truth may lie concealed within them. And in any case, there's nothing contradictory to inner religion present in them. This is not a ringing endorsement of doctrine from Kant, but he's sort of giving an image of how a clergy member might be able to sort of hold their nose and carry out their duties, even if they're engaged in a public debate that is quite critical of official doctrine. So if you step into the role of a scholar, even if in the rest of your life you're a member of the clergy, you can still engage in this critical discussion, according to Kant. And then he moves into a very interesting argument about human nature and legitimate government. Something that we'll look at in more detail next week is social contract theory, which is an attempt to work out what's the basis for legitimate government. And the social contract theorists have a sense that to be legitimate you need to consent to the government, and yet most of us are just born into a governmental system. There's been no process of active consent. How do you understand it? And one way that this is understood is the notion of a social contract, which is often thought about either counterfactually or as something that's happened in the distant past. The idea that there's a group of people that got together at some point and consented to binding themselves to a particular kind of governmental authority, and once they make that decision, it binds all of their heirs. So we don't get to make the choice because someone made that choice a long time ago, and that choice still binds us. Kant is worried about this kind of objection. Maybe we have already entered into some kind of social contract where we've agreed we're not going to allow enlightenment to happen. We're not going to allow people to emerge from their minority. And Kant says you cannot enter into that kind of agreement. It is not valid. There are limits on the agreements that humans can impose on themselves, and one of those limits is human nature. He says it is a crime against human nature whose original vocation lies precisely in such progress. If any generation were to enter into this kind of contract, future generations are entitled to reject it. Now this becomes a kind of debate that will ricochet through the course. In political theory, it becomes particularly important to think what are the limits on government due to the confrontation with the Holocaust. What do you do if you've got an entire rogue state that has gone through all the formalities of enacting legislation within the bounds of that state, and yet it engages in actions that the rest of the world looks on as horrific? How do you understand the standpoint from which that can be criticized if you're in this sort of social contract kind of space where you think, well, if people agree to do it, that makes it legitimate? Kant is appealing to human nature as something that stands above what humans can do and limits it. So that's one of the things that people will appeal to say we can't do just everything. Not everything is legitimate. Human nature provides a standard. Some people will be able to appeal to religious standards. So God or religion provides a standard, and states or governmental institutions that violate those standards are illegitimate. And this is actually very, very important, the appeal to religion in many social movements historically. Okay? The society is unjust, but God is just, and so I can oppose my society grounded in my religion. And there are more secular approaches that say you can look at the diversity within history or within a society, that no society is monolithic, that the fact that you've got an oppressive government or even an oppressive majority within a particular state doesn't mean that that's the only point of view that you have access to. So people debate this issue. What do you do to prevent people from binding themselves into horrific forms of government? So for Kant, it's human nature. And then Kant says a legitimate law is one that people would impose upon themselves autonomously. And that if people wouldn't impose it on themselves autonomously, the monarch cannot do it to them. For the legislative authority of the monarch rests precisely on this, Kant says, that he unites in his will the collective will of the people. So governments can't do just anything they'd like. They're limited by the degree to which they're able to represent the will of the people. So some of our readings this week will pick up on some of these ideas and say these are really quite radical, and we can do some good critical work with them today. while also saying some of these ideas are really quite problematic. They're very exclusionary, and will be more critical of those bits. And they'll ask the question, can we inherit a vision of enlightenment that takes what we would now today regard as more progressive elements, while leaving behind the elements that seem more exclusionary?